So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today on our newly launched Humanitarian Data Transparency Research Series. My name's Gary Forster. I'm the Chief Executive here at Publish What You Fund. I'm joined by my colleague, Henry Lewis, who's the Acting Humanitarian Project Manager, and he will be taking us through the presentation shortly. We're also joined by the other half of our research team, Max Silen from Ground Truth Solutions and Ruba Ishak. For those of you who aren't familiar with Publish What You Fund is the global campaign for aid and development transparency. We envisage a world where aid and development information is transparent, available, and used for effective decision-making, public accountability, and lasting change. We campaign to amplify the benefits of aid transparency for better development and humanitarian outcomes. I'll now pass over to Max, who can give us an introduction to Ground Truth Solutions.
Thank you, Gary. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. So Ground Truth Solutions, we are a Vienna-based INGO that works with and for people affected by humanitarian crises to really try and understand how they experience the humanitarian efforts that are taken on their behalf, and then to ultimately help them influence that aid provision. So our main methodology is rooted in two traditions of inquiry. On the one hand, we have the sort of participatory development thinking that is combined on the other with a sort of business world emphasis on customer satisfaction. So we examine how affected people see the relevance and fairness of the support they receive, whether they know what to expect, how to seek recourse if they don't feel safe, for example. But we also want to know how they feel about their own ability to control their futures, as well as whether they respect those that provide aid. And ultimately, we do so using mainly quantitative perception surveys and of late more and more qualitative approaches. And in some cases, we work on contrasting affected people's perceptions with perceptions of aid providers. So for this project, we've largely focused on the perceptions of aid providers, but have done so in two contexts where we've had multiple ongoing research projects that look at both sides of that. So yeah, thank you, and back to you, Gary.
Thank you, Max. So just a couple of quick things. One, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available to watch online afterwards. Secondly, please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll pick these up at the end, and that'll form our discussion. I will now hand over to Henry to take us through the presentation.
Great, thank you, Gary. Welcome, everyone. As Gary mentioned, my name is Henry, and I'm the Acting Humanitarian Project Manager at Publish What You Fund. So today I'll be providing an overview of the Grand Bargain and Transparency Agenda, for those of you who are less involved in it, and then an overview of the project itself. I'll then talk you through the findings of each of the reports that we've produced, the overall conclusion, a summary of the recommendations that we've made, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So the Grand Bargain was launched at the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul to help address this financing gap in humanitarian response. According to the UN's High-Level Panel on Humanitarian Financing, this funding gap was originally estimated to be approximately $15 billion. As such, the Grand Bargain set out 9 key areas of focus to help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the humanitarian system. One of these areas was greater transparency, which is workstream 1, and this workstream is co-convened by the Dutch government and the World Bank. So since 2016, significant gains have been made in the transparency agenda, including an increase in the publication of humanitarian-related data, and more recently, the development and launch of a humanitarian dashboard. However, the full potential of more transparent humanitarian information is yet to be realised. This information still does need to be actively used to assist decision-making on the ground. Therefore, Publish What You Fund, in partnership with Ground Truth Solutions, have been embarking on a research programme with 2 country deep dives to understand the information needs of humanitarian actors on the ground and the challenges they face in accessing and using this information. So this project is funded by the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs in partnership with development initiatives. So this research has three main objectives, as can be seen. Our first objective was to increase understanding of the information needs and challenges of humanitarian actors on the ground, in particular local and national responders. Secondly, we wanted to identify existing open data standards, platforms and tools, and assess their accessibility and usefulness in relation to meeting the needs and addressing the challenges that we've identified. And lastly, we wanted to identify possible improvements to these open data standards, platforms and tools to better provide the information needed and in a way that makes it accessible to these actors. So as you can see, the project has been taking place over the last 18 months or so, and originally started back in early 2019 with the development of the research methodology, the country selection and the desk research. So from the outset, we did recognise that protracted crises would offer a more suitable learning environment for this research than an early stage response. And this was down to engaging with stakeholders we consulted, who also saw value in us comparing kind of two different types of humanitarian crisis to be able to compare and contrast the findings. So as such, our final case study countries were Bangladesh, where the refugee response is characterised by a relatively static population that is frequently affected by natural disasters, and then Iraq, which has experienced an extended period of crisis where the population is dynamic and frequently moving within the country and across the border as a result of conflict. So other parts of this project included our desk analysis and literature review, the launch of an online survey, and our field visits to Iraq and Bangladesh in August and September last year. I'm just going to ask Max to talk a bit more about the online survey before I go back into the presentation. So Max.
Thank you, Henry. So yeah, the objective of the online survey was to broadly quantify the types of information humanitarian actors were using, the types of information they had access to that were important to them, but also to look a little bit at what type of data they were collecting themselves, and to then sort of define gaps that existed in terms of the information ecosystem available, and what types of information humanitarian actors were looking for. So we used an online survey through which we targeted national and international NGOs, host governments, coordination bodies, working groups, donors, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, community-based organizations. So generally any sort of relevant actor in the humanitarian space. And we asked them a series of close-ended, open-ended, Likert scale and rank order questions with a bit of room at the end to allow them to give a bit of a more qualitative response to the work that we were doing. We carried out the survey in June and August 2019 in both countries, thankfully with a lot of support of the humanitarian actors on the ground using Survey Gizmo, the online survey platform. The questions were sense-checked. You can also find them annexed to the reports, and it was available to respondents in Bangladesh, as well as English, as well as Kurdish and Arabic in Iraq, in order to allow us to really hone in on some of the more local organization perceptions across those contexts. In total, we captured 187 responses from over 100 organizations, meaning that we had 78 responses in Bangladesh and 109 in Iraq. So yeah, that pretty much summarizes the online survey that we carried out. Back to you, Henry.
Great, thanks, Max. So since then, we've been doing the data analysis, producing all 4 reports, and engaging with key stakeholders around the reports and the recommendations, and then now we're launching the reports. So to give you a bit of a better idea of the scope of this work, beyond the literature review, we had approximately 50+ interviews with global stakeholders and humanitarian experts, and so this phase involved the country selection of Iraq and Bangladesh, as already mentioned. Max has just talked a bit about the online survey, so I won't cover that again. And then we had, after this online survey, we had the in-country field trips themselves, where we undertook 66 key informant interviews across both countries, and they were pretty evenly split, with 32 in Iraq and 34 in Bangladesh. And we did interview a broad range of stakeholders, including local and national NGOs, INGOs, UN agencies, cluster coordinators, donor missions, and government ministries. If you'd like to know more about the research, you can find our full methodology on our website. So from all this work, we've produced 4 research briefs. So I'll be talking about each one in more detail in a minute. But just to give you a quick summary, we have research brief 1, which is the publication of humanitarian funding data, which specifically looks at the use of funding data on the International Aid Transparency Initiative system and the financial tracking system by OCHA, also on other financial tracking systems such as the OECD DAC and AIMS. We have research brief 2 on data collection, analysis and use in protracted humanitarian crises, which explores issues of coordination, effective data sharing, information management functions, and how all of these together impact on the quality of data being produced and shared within the 2 responses. Got research brief 3, the use challenges and opportunities associated with digital platforms, which digs into all the platforms that we uncovered in the research and any opportunities for improvement on these platforms. And then lastly, we have research brief 4, which is looking at data use capacity, and specifically looks into what support and capacity frontline organisations need to improve their data use experience. So now we can get into the main findings. We'll start with research brief 1 on the publication of humanitarian funding data. So as you can see, we do have 5 main findings from this report. We'll be going through each one in a bit more detail now, but I'll just give you a bit of time to read these. So our first finding, this is finding 1A, is funding data is of greater relevance to coordinators while implementers need management information. So just to clarify, for the purpose of this research, we did split actors into 2 different groups, as can be seen with the coordinators and implementers groups. So we saw coordinators as kind of more recipient government officials and country level coordination groups, while implementers were those who directly work or directly delivered assistance to beneficiaries themselves or right on the front lines. But I just want to acknowledge that we do recognise that certain actors do fit into both of these categories. You know, for example, UN agencies can be both coordinators and implementers within a response. So with regards to information needs, we found that implementers in particular prioritised the need for up-to-date, granular, validated management information to inform the design and implementation of their programmes. While on the other hand, coordinators sought information detailing the numbers, types and activities of actors within a response and required this information to be more consolidated. Specifically addressing financial flow data, kind of defined here as information relating to the amounts, channels, agents and outcomes of activity, and which can be attained through IATI and FTS as mentioned. This type of data was less frequently mentioned, and in this case only by coordinated type organisations who needed a picture of what was happening at the macro level of the response. To just give you an idea of needs, from our online survey, only 17% of respondents in Iraq and 15% in Bangladesh reported that they use financial flow data frequently. And as you can see, 30% in Iraq and 35% in Bangladesh said they needed more financial flow data. So moving on to our second finding, finding 1B, this is funding data and the auxiliary data that accompanies it is relevant to coordinators in the field. The quality needs to be improved. So during this research, coordinators did demonstrate a need for the type of financial information that is already reported to IATI and FTS, which I talked about in the first finding. But we did find that a number of stakeholders raised concerns about the quality of data from these 2 sources, and specifically questioned its comprehensiveness, timeliness, relevance, and accuracy. On top of this concern, interviewees did complain that the UN system on the ground largely does not report to IATI, so it can make it almost impossible to get a kind of holistic picture of what is happening in the response. As a result of this, we were unable to find any use cases of IATI data being used for decision making. And then following this, in terms of the auxiliary data that we found in this finding, coordinators stated a need for results and evaluation data, which is data that can already be accommodated by IATI. So IATI standards, so there is an opportunity here regarding how non-financial data can be incorporated better moving forward. A third finding 1C, is awareness of IATI data on the ground is low. So at the global level, awareness of IATI as a standard for delivering transparent data has increased significantly, as has the number of IATI publishers and the quality and quantity of data being reported. But when we get onto the country level, particularly within our country case studies, awareness and use of IATI remains extremely low. To give you an idea, among our online survey respondents across both countries, only 5% reported being aware of IATI, while again, only 1% in Iraq and 3% in Bangladesh said they had previously used IATI data. So this shows just how low awareness is and use is on the ground as a decision-making tool. So our fourth finding is finding 1D is that awareness of FTS on the ground is higher. Again, the completeness of data is a challenge. So we did find that awareness and use of STS was higher than for IATI. About approximately 37% of survey respondents being aware of the platform, and 10% saying they use it on a regular basis. And this was across both countries. But again, as in the previous finding, interviews raised concerns about the quality and comprehensiveness of the data on FTS. And we did see that in both countries, interviewees reported that their trust in FTS data was frequently undermined as a result of data discrepancies. So to give you an example, stakeholders did mention to us that there was differences between figures on FTS and those outlined in the humanitarian response plans for both countries. So given these challenges, it was not clear to what degree FTS data was used for decision-making on the ground. So I'll move on to the last finding of report 1 is finding 1E, which is that there are other sources of financial flow data, but they also face the same quality and timeliness issues. So we did find that there were a few other sources of financial flow data that interviewees had referred to, in particular AIM systems and the OECD DAC. However, stakeholders stated these also suffer from timeliness issues. So as an example, in Bangladesh, where the government operates an AIM system, we found that users frequently mentioned that the quality of the information held within is limited by the inconsistent frequency and comprehensiveness of the donor reporting. So this again limits their use as decision-making tools within both responses. So now we move on to research brief 2, which is looking at data collection, analysis, and use in protracted humanitarian crisis. So again, we have 5 key findings for this report, and again, I'll be going through each one individually. So our first finding is finding 2A. So the quality of data is a concern to on-the-ground coordinators and implementers. So as with report 1, we have again split actors into coordinators and implementers, just to make it clear. But in this case, coordinators sought information to understand the scale of the response, the variety of actors involved, and to perform oversight across the responses. Well, implementers, on the other hand, reported that their requirements include, again, as mentioned in report 1, included better management information, needs assessments data, and beneficiary data. So the overarching point to come out of this particular finding is that while stakeholders in Iraq and Bangladesh did comment positively with regard to the quantity of information available within these responses, they were in search of kind of better quality and more comprehensive coverage. So this is shown in the graph that is here by the fact that in Iraq, 61% of survey respondents were unsatisfied or somewhat unsatisfied with the quality of data, while in Bangladesh, it was 55%. So specifically, they mentioned that they wanted data sets that were reliable and comparable with clear and rigorous methodologies attached and addressed all needs and regions within the country or area of response. Moving on to finding 2B, information management capacity is more of an immediate issue for implementers than coordinators. So as I just mentioned, we found that actors on the ground were positive about the amount of information available. However, they had concerns about a lack of information management functions, particularly dedicated information management officers and units. both at the response and organisational levels to analyse and use all this data effectively. So specifically, local NGOs, INGOs and some cluster coordinators interviewed in both countries said that IM positions are not being adequately funded by donors and were not seen as important positions compared to other roles within the response. This was despite some stakeholders that we spoke to saying that they thought IM positions were essential to help the response and make sure this data was exchanged effectively and efficiently. So the result of this is that a lack of IM capacity is hindering the effective analysis, use and sharing of data within organisations, between partners and more widely across the responses. We do cover capacity issues more in report 4, which I'll get to at the end. So finding 2C is data sharing practices are inconsistent and limited. So again, from our survey, we found that over half of respondents from both countries shared data to help improve coordination. However, once we got on the ground, we found that data sharing practices between organisations are in reality often inconsistent and limited. And the reasons for this include local and national NGOs lack confidence in the rigour of their data collection processes or have concerns about the perceived quality of their data. There is a perception that some UN agencies and INGOs value some form of competitive advantage gained by being the custodians of primary data. All actors expressed to us concerns about the way in which data may be used and interpreted by third parties, in particular national government. So for example, this could be data that does not show the organisation in a favourable light, such as evaluations which indicate failings. Local and national NGOs and some smaller INGOs are aware of or do not have the capacity to share data on existing data sharing platforms. There is limited use or complete absence of data sharing protocols, agreements and MOUs between data producers and third-party organisations. And then there is some data is deemed too sensitive to share, even with trusted parties and where the data sharing protocols are in place. And then lastly, local NGOs are not aware that others might find their data useful. So it's a combination of these that is limiting data sharing and ultimately means that important decisions are being made without seeing or having access to all the information they need to make them. Finding 2D is around data sensitivity. So data sensitivity presents another challenge that stakeholders need to overcome when collecting and analysing and using data. So again, on the ground, we found that disjointed rules and policies around data sensitivity, such as a lack of frameworks and guidelines, is leading to confusion and conflicting ideas about what data can be shared and in what format. While many organisations we found do actually have their own internal guidance on sensitive data, both responses did lack a common guide on how to handle and share sensitive data within and across the response. So as a result, some local responders interview highlighted that INGOs and UN in particular on the side of caution by not sharing data rather than risking their reputation, even when this data can be aggregated safely. Just want to note that we do recognise the do no harm principle here, and that in some cases full transparency does have the potential to cause more harm than good. I think this needs to be explored on a case-by-case basis. We're also aware of the global guidelines that are being developed by UN OCHA and the Centre for Humanitarian Data on responsible data, but as we heard on the ground, it is sometimes the implementation of these sorts of guidelines at the field level where there are difficulties. Our last finding in report 2 is finding 2E, which is there is a need for clear and robust methodologies with minimum control standards for data collection. So at the field level, in this research, we found that data collection is currently characterised by issues around a lack of minimum standards for data collection with regards to robust methodologies, a lack of ethical sampling, no set guidelines on the frequency of assessments, a lack of feedback loops to beneficiaries, a lack of efforts to minimise duplication of interviews, a lack of quality assurance processes, and lastly, political influence, such as authorities restricting access to certain areas or affected populations, or creating bureaucratic hurdles and delays. So as a result, some stakeholders we interviewed expressed very real concerns about the lack of quality control around data collection practices, and that some beneficiaries and those on receiving aid may be expected to participate in multiple needs assessments by different organisations in short periods of time, often with little or no feedback loops as to how that data is being used. So to give you an example, in Bangladesh, we heard that Rohingya refugees were being interviewed regularly, multiple times and by multiple different NGOs, all collecting relatively the same information. So we're having to relive the trauma of their experiences over and over again. And this did include sensitive topics around gender-based violence and child protection. On top of this, stakeholders also expressed concern that there is a lack of alignment and oversight on the development of needs assessment methodologies and tools, particularly the smaller localized agency-specific assessments, which can impede data analysis as it is difficult to disaggregate and compare data sets within the response. So that brings us to the end of report 2. We're now on to report 3, which focuses on the use challenges and opportunities of digital platforms used in crisis settings. So we have 4 main findings here. Our first finding is awareness and use of platforms tended to focus on a few specific platforms. So as you can see from the table, there are certain platforms that interviewees were aware of and use frequently, which we've outlined here. We did find that the use of these platforms largely mirrored the results we obtained on which types of data users accessed the most each month, which included needs assessment data, 4W data, mapping and location data, monitoring data, and then population and demographic data. Our second finding for this report is that the number and usability of existing platforms is sufficient for accessing data, but users want transparency of raw data and collection methodologies. So we did find that users had 2 very specific technical requirements when it comes to digital platforms. And firstly, they wanted the ability to download raw data in easily accessible formats, such as Excel. And then secondly, across the board, we saw that users wanted the ability to download underlying methodologies so they could understand how data was collected and then more accurately determine its legitimacy and value. So within this report itself, we do explore individual platforms in more detail. So I won't cover that here, but we did find that the main platforms used were Report Hub in Bangladesh, Activity Info in Iraq, and then IOM's Displacement Tracking Matrix, and the Needs and Population Monitoring One platform, Humanitarian Response.info, Relief Web, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, UNHCR's Operational Data Platform, and then there were just other sector-specific platforms such as Health Information Systems or Education Information Systems. But there was a general consensus among interviewees that the number, type, and usability of the platforms that already exist was sufficient to meet their needs. So finding 3C is that while platforms for uploading reporting data are sufficient, agreement on which to use and data sharing concerns are creating challenges. So again, with regard to the most prominent data platforms to use for uploading and sharing data, it was Report Hub in Bangladesh and Activity Info in Iraq. Other platforms were also used by stakeholders for uploading and sharing data. Some of these included, again, Humanitarian Response.info, the IOM, DTM, and NPM, FTS, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, or HDX, Relief Web, UNHCR's Operational Data Portal, and then, again, cluster-specific platforms. In this case, across both countries, we found that 1/4 of our survey respondents said they had no challenges when seeking to publish more data. But for those that did have challenges, they highlighted three particular issues, which was around sensitivity of data, data quality, and then understanding of other platforms, including which ones they are supposed to use and report to. Our fourth finding, or our last finding in report 3, is that inconsistency in reporting and underlying data quality issues are inhibiting use. So overall, we did find that data landscape in both countries is characterized by inconsistent reporting, patchy data in the sense that much of the data is kind of untrustworthy. But stakeholders explained to us that this can be a result of information being shared rather than raw data, and then with no explanation of how the raw data has been treated to create information products, such as dashboards and maps and reports. Different data providers producing data in different formats, and so this includes with having different definitions for things, or spelling, or even spelling of towns and communities, which makes it hard to bring it all together. And data providers using different methodologies for collecting and analysing data. So this is even within specific sectors. So now we on to our last of our 4 reports. So research before, which is around looking at data capacity. We have 3 key findings for this report. So our first finding 4A, states that current funding models and reporting requirements are inhibiting data use capacity on the ground. So, as you all know, humanitarian funding cycles are often short and short-term and project-based. What work is being done to make funding more flexible, particularly through embargo work streams 7 and 8. This is unlikely to change in the immediate future. However, the way other elements of funding are managed, such as around indirect project costs, overheads, or training and mentoring budgets, could actually make a difference to those on the ground. We heard during our KIs that limited contributions, either from donors themselves or through the Humanitarian Response Plan funds, to support indirect project costs is leaving little room for their organisations to invest in and develop their data management capacities. And this is impacting the ability of actors to collect, process and analyse and share information in a comprehensive and timely manner. And in many cases, we saw that responsibilities, due to a lack of capacity, are being shifted to staff who do not have the necessary skills on data, and who in turn are drawn away from their own responsibilities where they'll be better placed. And we did find this is having a disproportionate impact on local and national NGOs in particular. So local NGOs we interviewed across both responses did put this down to the fact that they only receive a very small proportion of response funding, which often does not support core costs or any indirect project costs. So as a result, again, they're unable to invest in longer term organisational projects such as upskilling staff on data management processes and data collection techniques, and then also, or updating internal policies around data sharing and data sensitivity. On top of this, a number of implementers, again, particularly local actors, but also INGOs, highlighted their concerns about the lack of insufficient funding explicitly for needs assessments. So as you all know, needs assessments are an essential part of humanitarian response, so it is important that data collected here is accurate and reliable. Once we were able to talk to people on the ground, it became clear that in most cases, donors do not fund these assessments directly. So organisations who already have limited capacity are having to be even more conservative with the resources they have and what they can allocate to these kind of activities. So the wider impact of these issues is a reduction in the quality of data that is, and as there isn't sufficient staff resources or time to invest in kind of developing things around data collection methodologies, validation processes, and other quality assurance checks on the data that they're collecting and sharing. Our second finding, 4B, is that transparency of how data is collected is just as important as the data itself. So here we found that if there is a lack of visibility on how data is managed and used across the response, and also within each organisation involved in a response, then there is a risk of data policies being improperly implemented. So to give you an example, numerous stakeholders in Iraq and Bangladesh mentioned that the majority of actors do not share their data collection methodologies, which effectively makes it impossible for users to determine the quality and rigour of the data that's being collected and shared. This is particularly important for those organisations that do not have the necessary capacity to develop their own data collection methodology, or lack the data collection skills, because other organisations being more transparent with their methodologies can be part of an important process for them to improve their quality of the data collection and share, so they can adapt from these and produce their own from these, seeing other people's methodologies. So this brings us to our last finding of the 4 reports, which is a lack of localization and data management capacity is inhibiting even basic data use and creating a 2-tiered system. In both countries, we found that while data production analysis capacity within larger INGOs, UN agencies and donors was mostly sufficient, it was smaller organisations, so particularly local NGOs, that were more frequently reporting capacity challenges. So local responders that we interviewed highlighted that this was actually due to an unwillingness on the part of donors, UN agencies or INGOs to invest in and prioritise training capacity development around data use in local NGOs. So the one thing that they made clear to us was that in reality, the capacity building of local NGOs is often not prioritised in practice. And then adding further pressure to this is the fact that the technical capacity of local NGOs is also being eroded by bigger organisations within both responses. And local NGOs we talked to on the ground kind of described the kind of brain drain associated with INGOs and UN recruiting their most capable staff who had already gained experience in data management. And this often came through INGOs and UN agencies offering higher salaries than these organisations, which, so as a consequence, the local organisations ended up having a high IM turnover, or information management officer turnover. So that brings us to the end of the individual findings. So in conclusion, whilst our research findings have been split across 4 different reports, we can conclude across all of them that while there has been a positive movement in publication efforts at the global level, data quality is a serious impediment to better use for decision making, especially at the ground level. And it is a result of issues around coordination, data sharing, and information management functions that is impacting data quality, and as a result is leading to a lack of trust in data among stakeholders. And users did time and again specify that it was questions around timeliness, comprehensiveness, and accuracy of the data that they were thinking about. So in order to address these challenges and other challenges outlined during this presentation, we believe there needs to be a more concerted effort from donors, UN agencies and INGOs to kind of address the structural issues that are acting as barriers. And we believe that this can be achieved through a mixture of improving local engagement with data users, and then better data governance and data leadership at the field level. So that brings us to our recommendations. So across the 4 reports, we did make a number of recommendations to the Grand Bargain, both to the transparency workstream and then to other relevant Grand Bargain work streams, which included workstream 2, the more support and funding tools to local and national responders, workstream 5, to improve joint and impartial needs assessments, workstream 6, which is around participation revolution, to include people receiving aid and making decisions which affect their lives, and then workstream 9, which is to harmonise and simplify reporting requirements. So our main recommendations draw on what I've just talked about in the conclusion. So firstly, the need to improve data quality across the board and make it more accessible and usable for decision making. And then secondly, to engage at the local level to improve both data capacity and data use. And then lastly, to consider options for establishing an inclusive data coordination entity at the field level, which could address some of these issues and help people out. I've only provided a brief summary of our recommendations here, but if you'd like to read them in full, then please download the reports from our website. So that brings us to the end of this presentation part of the webinar. I hope this has provided some useful insights to you. We still have time for some questions and answers, so as Gary mentioned at the beginning, please feel free to send them using the Q&A tab at the bottom. I'll hand back to Gary, Max and Ruben to take you through this part.
Thanks, Henry. Can you just take us back to the recommendations slide, please?
Yep.
So yeah, for our viewers, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them in just a second. So there's obviously a lot of detail here. The 4 reports are all pretty comprehensive and are available on our website. So please feel free to dig into those that you think are more relevant. But there are some cross-cutting issues that come out of them that I just wanted to touch on. So one is this issue of kind of data engagement and how actors on the ground who are producing or holding information actually engage with other stakeholders to make sure that that information is shared equitably and understood, and that stakeholders understand what it means. This has come up across the work that we've done, and to give you an example, you can see here on the recommendations tab that the word quality is mentioned twice. It's throughout the reports. Stakeholders continually talked about the quality of data, and one thing that we have been asked since producing these reports is, well, what's the definition of quality? Now, we have an overarching definition of quality, you know, information that's comprehensive, that's timely, but actually what we found doing this work is that each stakeholder to some degree has their own definition of quality, right? And that to understand that, really we need stakeholders on the ground to engage. So we need those organizations that are producing or collecting and then analyzing and producing substantial amounts of data. We need them to talk with their counterparts in country so that both parties understand what the data is and what it means. And we're not seeing that. We're seeing pockets of brilliant practice, but we're not seeing that spread. And the same in terms of the definition of quality. Another example is the definition of sensitive data. Again, sensitive data came up a lot. We know that there are global guidelines, but there are different interpretations at the ground level, and then different interpretations between even maybe different sectors or different types of organization. So again, depending on the context in which these humanitarian organizations are working and the kinds of data they're collecting, their different definition of what is sensitive and how it should therefore be handled carefully, it could be different to other organizations or other contexts. So it reinforces this point around the producers of data and the publishers of data taking the time and the energy to meet with their counterparts, to present the information, to discuss it, and to talk about future plans and how that information is being used and so forth, so that agreement can be reached locally on such issues as what is acceptable quality, what kind of platform should we be reporting to, how frequently, what data should be sensitive, and how are we going to handle that data, and so on. There's very much a local element that I think in the past may have been missed, as we rightly have pushed for kind of global publication of data and at the response level, kind of national level data. But actually understanding what the users need is vitally important, and we try and draw that out. So one cross-cutting theme is the need to engage around the data, and then the other cross-cutting theme is about coordination. And one of the recommendations here, the second bullet point, is around consider options for establishing an inclusive data coordination entity. Now, our report goes into the level of suggesting that a data cluster might be appropriate. It does feel like many of the challenges we identified around, you know, agreement on what data should be collected, how it should be reported, with what frequency, definitions of quality and sensitive data, etc., could be resolved more promptly and in a more inclusive manner within the response if there were a coordination mechanism that had oversight of data per se. Not dissimilarly to the way that we have a logistics cluster, which sort of manages at a cross-cutting level the logistics response and capacity in these humanitarian contexts. So just wanted to pick up on those. We do have one question. Okay, so what types of data were considered as sensitive in both cases? So as to my point there, it really varied. It varied between the response. So depending on whether people felt that there were specific actors in the response that couldn't be trusted with data. And I think for those of us who have worked in these environments, you know what I'm referring to. There could be certain NGOs, there could be certain government departments, there could be the police or military in some cases, there could be other groups completely that it's felt shouldn't be given access to even basic information about the response, but that actually we found that the definition of sensitive did depend on what the local organisations felt, what they were collecting, and that discussion really has to happen at the ground level. So there's obvious instances, okay, where we're talking about, for example, gender-based violence. You know, there's a whole bunch of information that can be collected there, which then has to be held in confidence for a variety of reasons, not least ethical and moral obligations to individuals' human rights, but also from a security perspective as well. And I think, you know, Henry talked about the issue of people being interviewed multiple times on sensitive subjects and not necessarily being explained to them how the feedback loops would work, how that information would be used, and stories of frustration if you keep giving people your personal stories, but then you don't really see your situation, your circumstances change. That frustration can arise. We got another couple of questions here. So from Rolf Cleef, do you have an idea about the data loop in how far is data that is delivered, published by organizations used by those same organizations? Yeah, I think so. I think this comes back to the question of, are we actually using the data that's being published? And our sense is that for maybe too long, and this comes from other areas of Publish What You Fund's research, but that for maybe too long we've had an expectation that if information is published, then it will be used. But that logic requires that users have A, are aware of the presence of the data, and B, have the skills and incentive to actually use it, make kind of evidence-based decisions. And what we're actually seeing is that the gap between publishing data and effective use needs to be filled by this data engagement piece. We actually genuinely need donor agencies, UN agencies, INGOs and NGOs to be sitting with their counterparts and saying, look, this is what we've got, this is what we know, and this is what we've collected, and this is the methodology we used, and here's the raw data, and this is how we're using that, and this is how we want to kind of share it with you. And we're not seeing that happen. We're seeing it a bit more in the development space. I'm thinking of the US government's development cooperation landscape tool, which helps produce country by country visualizations of aid flows, and is being used by USAID country mission directors to inform their strategy development in countries and so on. But in the humanitarian space, outside of how it contributes to the humanitarian response plan and the multi-cluster needs assessment, we're seeing an awful lot of information being produced that then isn't shared for various reasons. The reports go into why that is. In some instances, people aren't confident of the data they've collected. They think it might cast them in a bad light. They're not aware that actually others would find it useful. So I think the reports dig into quite a bit some of the challenges there, but ultimately I think it's a mindset shift, maybe moving away from this expectation that publication will lead to use, to recognizing that publication plus engagement will lead to use where it's appropriate, and where it's one thing that came up through the work as well is that use doesn't always have to be the end goal. It doesn't have to be that, you know, government stakeholders in these responses use the data to make evidence-based decisions. There's a huge value in engaging around the data so that those same governments have confidence in what international actors are doing and understand what international actors are doing and trust them, and therefore you get stronger partnerships and relationships. So I think there is a bit of a mindset shift for those of us, including myself, and to some degree what Publish What You Fund has worked on for a few years, in moving away from publication, which is still important. We still need to have that foundation of data, but to thinking more about how we actually engage. And only through that engagement will we get the feedback on the quality of the data and the gaps and whether the data meets the needs of the stakeholders. Rather than just publishing and hoping that maybe we get an email from a user saying, oh, can you add these fields, or can I ask you this question? And as I think a lot of us know, some of the quality concerns in the data would be remedied by those kinds of feedback loops. We've got a question here for data coordination. Was there discussions about the presence, usefulness, role of IM working groups? So IM working groups are covered in the reports. And of course we only looked at 2 contexts in this research. We don't want to extrapolate too much, but we found differences in the structure and capacity and mandate of those working groups. I think mandate was probably the most important issue, is whether they have you know, the example that Henry gave about Bangladesh, where you had organizations, you know, the Cox's Bazar camps are relatively easy to access for international and local organizations. So you can go in with a relatively weak data collection methodology that's potentially ethically spurious, and you can collect information, and there isn't anyone to kind of stop or control that effort. We did hear examples that in other responses, and I think it was the Syria response that was given as an example, that there is a kind of peer review process, because the working group, the IAM working group there, has such a powerful mandate, that there's a peer review process to prevent poor methodologies being used by organizations going in to collect data. And it might be that in that response it is down to the IAM working group's mandate being more powerful. It might also be that the security concerns in that environment are such that they have to really control the number of organizations going in and collecting information. So I think it's something that probably needs more investigation. That's why we wanted to raise the point about whether a data coordination cluster would be a suitable way of ensuring that you had the capacity and the mandate on the ground, because you need both. Yeah, that's probably, I don't know if Ruba, Max or Henry wanted to say anything else on that point before I take the next question.
No, I guess a general comment, again, it depends on the context, and given you have that variation, that's where you'll see the discrepancies and the ability for an IAM group to have the mandate, as you said. So as this study has looked at two contexts, we still need to broaden this out to really understand the different contexts that this exists in as well.
And there was definitely a sense that the kind of questions, look, and we respect that the humanitarian operations are often lack the resource they need to respond to the challenges that they face. But there was definitely a recognition that the kind of questions that we were asking in the interrogation that we were doing was certainly welcome by a broad cross-section of stakeholders who really wanted to dig into some of the issues on how information is shared in these responses and how it can be improved, and both from a quality and from an equity perspective. And that, you know, arguably better resourced IAM working groups could perform this function of essentially doing a response audit on how is the information being shared, what are the platforms that people are reporting to, how are people updating needs assessment registers frequently enough, and do the clusters have the support that they need to monitor the quality of data and so on. So there's definitely, and in an earlier iteration of our research, we produced a kind of a draft terms of reference for what that coordination function could look like in the response. Because so much, as we said, it's a cross-cutting finding of this work, so much of what we have seen is that there is a local, there is a very important local element to data. And while there are absolutely laudable efforts going on at a global level, Henry mentioned UN OCHA's data guidelines, there are other initiatives, it's the implementation at the grassroots that's hard. And in part, we need to meet in the middle somewhere where we've got an insight from what stakeholders on the ground need and want versus kind of the global best practice, and then work out something that's appropriate for the context, because they are so unique. And you know, I know that we all know that, but every environment is different. They're collecting different information on different types of crises with a different balance of stakeholders at play. We have one question here. In terms of capacity building and information management not being funding priorities for grant makers, was this actually stated by the grant makers themselves, or was it a case of the organizations assuming it would seem an excessive ask and limiting these budget lines in proposals? I would say it's maybe a combination of the two. What we did hear is we heard a number of major donors say, well, we can't actually fund local organizations directly. Ergo, they have to be funded through other sort of prime partners. You know, there are still international bilateral and multilateral donors that are unable to fund national organizations directly. So you can understand how the power then plays out and the incentives behind keeping your proposals as cheap and as, you know, as cost effective as possible, and maybe not wanting to build in elements of information management capacity and training into such a proposal that would ultimately increase the cost of it. But I think there is a discussion there as well on understanding where do the donors sit, and this was something we didn't have the opportunity to look into, but where do the donors sit on what is acceptable to be direct charge to projects? I don't want to get into the nitty gritty, but it does matter. If local organizations or INGOs can't direct charge information management capacity and training to a grant, then they're going to have to stick it in overhead. And we all know that the overhead allowances that are provided are extremely strict, especially for smaller organizations who maybe don't have the economies of scale that they need. So I think there's a whole piece on working, and there are other groups within the Grand Bargain, other work streams that are looking into some of this. But I think there's definitely an interrogation required into the detail of what scope there is to better improve information management capacity. Okay, so that's all the questions we've had so far. Does anyone else have any questions? That includes you, Ruba, and Max as well.
Maybe just a quick question to wrap it up, because I think it addresses what I would be curious about. Is it's been a couple of months since we've engaged. You guys have pulled together a great report. What do you see as next steps on this research, on this project? I think that's a great way to wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so look, we are going to be spending the next few months working with individual organizations, so a mixture of donors, UN agencies, INGOs, and going through in detail through the recommendations of this work and getting an understanding from them in terms of where they sit. Now, we know that of the recommendations we've provided, some institutions are already doing quite well on many of them, and they may not be so relevant. But it'd be good to hear from those organizations how they interpret the findings, whether they recognize them. Now, we've done some stakeholder engagement already, and we have so far found that people do recognize these recommendations as being applicable and as addressing the challenges that they see in their operations at the front lines. But we'll be working with those kind of organizations to understand, do they recognize the findings? Is it something they're already working on or have already remedied? Or is it something that some new sort of effort is required? What are their responses to some of the bigger cross-cutting themes? So this issue of data coordination, how do they respond to that? Are there already pushes within the sector to have something like a data cluster that we can maybe get behind? How do they feel about the data engagement? Now, we know through other work that we've done that a number of donors are, and UN agencies as well, are already talking about, look, it's time for a shift in the kind of aid transparency, humanitarian transparency space. We have been publishing a lot. It hasn't necessarily delivered the development effectiveness that we were after. Is it because we're not spending enough time being transparent at the local level? I think that's a real challenge that people are talking about. So really trying to understand the validity and the implementability, if that's the word, of our recommendations, and what barriers there might be, so that we can go back to the Grand Bargain and its signatories and we can say, you know, these are our recommendations, these are the ones that have got real mileage and can really be implemented and we can make a difference on, and these are the ones that are a bit tougher and we're still wrestling with. If there's no further questions, it doesn't look like there are, then thank you very much for bearing with us and for listening to our findings. Henry's email address is on the slide at the moment. Please feel free to fire us any questions or any advice that you might have, and we will, and please feel free to download the reports from our website. And in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us and have a good day.